The idea behind these sessions is essentially, we've seen a lot of changes in the global trading system over the past couple of years. And we want to make sense of how exactly these changes are going to be affecting our campaigning. So we want to make sure that we're not essentially fighting yesterday's battles when it comes to sort of the bread and butter of trade justice campaigning over the past few decades. So today we're going to be hearing about subsidies. So subsidies in a particular context of the green transition and the energy transition. We have two speakers with us. So we're going to hear from Avantika from India, from the Center for Science and Environment. And Avantika is going to tell us a little bit about what these changes in the trading system as it relates to the use of subsidies by by the EU and the US. What are the stakes here for the Global South? And then we'll hear from Ted Furtick, who's at the Blue-Green Alliance, and he's gonna give us a view from the US, particularly of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the key pieces of legislation encoding this new use of subsidies in the US. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Avantika.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Hope that's visible to everyone. You can all see my screen, right? Okay. Great. So hello, everyone. Good evening from New Delhi. It's a toasty 45 plus degrees outside here, so lots of fun. I am a program manager at CSE, the Center for Science and Environment. We are a 44-year-old think tank that has been researching climate and environmental issues for a long time. I myself have been at CSE for about 4 years, and currently I lead the climate policy program here at CSE. CSE also has an affiliate publication, an environmental magazine called Down to Earth that we use as a platform to put out a lot of our research and advocacy. So we started looking at this trade climate nexus about a year ago, and one disclaimer for what I present today is that we're still researching a lot of these issues, so we don't have clear-cut answers to a lot of the questions. In fact, more research produces more questions at this point, but definitely looking forward to a good discussion today and also learning from some of you, and will try my best to answer questions, but if not, happy to just continue talking beyond this as well. So what I'm going to present today, we took a very specific view of the new climate and trade regime. Last year, I wrote a long-form piece for Down to Earth, which basically was picking up from the CBAM announced by the EU and the IRA announced by the US, but also a number of other kind of global trends that were showing a shift towards industrial policy, protectionism, capturing of the new green supply chains. So in this piece I wrote last year, we took a very specific view of how historical justice questions interact with these new developments. And yeah, that's the lens through which we looked at them. I'm sure there are angles that we haven't covered, but yeah. So just to get started very quickly, we are seeing a rush to secure the green supply chain of the future. This is stemming from a global pressure to rapidly decarbonize our economies. And there are specific prescriptions for this set out by various bodies, the IEA, the IPCC. At the center of a lot of this is essentially the industrial sector, which itself needs to decarbonize, but it's also going to be very instrumental in producing a lot of the green technologies that will be vital to address and tackle the climate crisis. To do this, countries have been proposing various policies to speed up this transition away from fossil fuels and move towards economy-wide decarbonization. Some of these policies, however, have been sparking fears of trade wars. And we've also seen that the climate problem is kind of being pushed as a facade to actually advance goals of reshoring and economic supremacy in a new green economy. So that's kind of the overall framing that we're looking at. The two main catalysts, as I mentioned earlier, were the announcement of the CBAM by the EU and the US Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, a number of things followed after that. The EU announced the Green Deal Industrial Plan. There are other countries like Australia, Canada, who are also looking at domestic industrial policy schemes to promote green manufacturing. India is also making some efforts towards subsidizing domestic green industry. From a trade perspective specifically, and I have to highlight that to get these trade specific views, we spoke to a number of trade experts because we're a climate policy team within a think tank. We're not trade experts. But what we heard is that a number of these policies within the current WTO regime can be questioned because the current trade rules treat subsidies, tariffs, and export bans essentially as trade distorting. And of course, value judgments about that differ, but that's what the current regime seems to promote in terms of free trade and liberalization. So zooming in on subsidies, and I'm sorry for the amount of text on this, I can share my slides later as a PDF if that's helpful, but essentially to meet the Paris Agreement's targets, we will need to not only decarbonize production, but also build and produce clean technologies at scale. There are multiple policy tools that can do this. Market-based policy tools like carbon taxes and carbon markets are supported by many, but these are definitely incremental in nature. They require a lot of institutional capacity, which particularly developing countries struggle with. Industrial policy, on the other hand, which are specific government interventions to direct strategic parts of the economy, could be a lot more effective. It could create green jobs, particularly in the context of decarbonization. It could create coalitions of support for the further growth of green industry. There are a number of industrial policy successes over the past few decades. A lot of the green technologies we see, from solar PV to electric vehicles, were developed over many decades with targeted government subsidies, public procurement efforts, and other strategic interventions by governments. India has a scheme called the Ujjwala scheme, which promotes the use of energy efficient LED bulbs, for which a huge public procurement program was created, and that's been quite successful. And of course, China's industrial policy across its entire economy has reaped a lot of success. So specifically for decarbonization, there's a lot of nuance within this, but the thinking that we tend to align with is that industrial policy might be precisely the kind of strategic planned effort you need to gear your economies away from fossil-based processes. Within this, subsidies could be a part of that policy package necessary to accelerate decarbonization. There is a point of view which sees subsidies as de-risking or essentially bribes to the private sector to get them to invest in climate-related projects. There's some relevance to that thought as well, especially if you have projects which fail, and then that's a huge waste of public resources. But on the whole, subsidies could be useful if targeted towards specific ends. This is a report from this January. It's an IMF working paper, which basically summarizes data for the resurgence of industrial policy initiatives that have been undertaken. And this summarizes data for 2023. And essentially, it states that there has been a resurgence of industrial policy tools as governments are coping with post-COVID sluggish growth, climate change, geopolitical tensions. About 48% of the tools and policy efforts analyzed were concentrated in the US, EU, and China. Overall, advanced economies have been more active than emerging economies and have been using corporate subsidies as a common instrument. Among the stated purposes for a lot of these industrial policy efforts, climate change was a stated reason for about 1/3 of the initiatives. And a big chunk, 71% of the initiatives, could be considered trade distorting within the current trade regime. So just the box on the right summarizes the difference between the approaches taken by advanced economies and emerging economies. And low-income developing countries frequently turn to, as opposed to corporate subsidies, they turn to more import barriers and stuff like that. But there's a big gap between advanced economies and emerging economies, particularly due to the lack of fiscal space of the latter, as well as administrative capacity and other reasons, which make them less able to roll out these policies than wealthy industrialized countries. Overall, China is definitely one of the countries that supports and doles out strategic interventions in its economy the most. But data has shown that the US and EU are also quite active, particularly in the realm of giving out corporate subsidies. A lot of the recent efforts, particularly from the US and EU, in terms of a resurgence, a return to industrial policy, have been driven by China's dominance of green technology supply chains. This is, I feel like, the favorite graph of a lot of climate policy wonks, in terms of showing China's dominance of majority of the processes involved in green technologies currently. So through decades of investments and with the giving out of low interest loans, free land, cheap energy, and other subsidies, China has become a world leader in green technology manufacturing. And decoupling themselves from China will cost the EU and US large amounts to have the same kind of manufacturing capacity and respond with the same kind of scale and speed as China has done. Particularly though, although the conversation is most focused on the US, EU, and China, developing countries have even less of a clear pathway to keep up or get ahead of China. So that's what the focus of our work has been, in trying to understand, outside of the behemoths of the US, EU, and China, what about the rest of the world? How do the rest of us keep up? So where does this leave developing countries? So the first part that we got a lot of feedback and views on was from the perspective of trade rules, where experts told us that the IRA, for example, has a number of issues on being compliant with the WTO from the perspective of local content requirements and so on. There were initial reactions from large manufacturing wealthy economies like the European Union, South Korea, and Japan, who feared losing companies who now want to invest in the US. These countries have managed to extract concessions under the IRA. From the perspective of the larger developing world, however, and the recent history of trade policy, trade agreements have prevented developing countries from implementing such industrial policies. Particularly the use of local content requirements, for example, has been discouraged. In the past, there have been cases where the US has taken India to the WTO for solar subsidies, where in a particular solar scheme, there were domestic content requirements, and India lost that particular ruling. And there's been research which has suggested that that particular case showed that the developed world still dictates the terms of the current trade regime. Developed countries are also frequently using the excuse of national security as a reason to bend trade rules, is another thing that we heard. This is applicable in the context of recent US tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to counter China's overcapacity. And there are a number of other examples where national security is kind of used as a justification. Further, what we also heard within this umbrella of trade rules and the current green policies, there have been reforms that are being pushed at the WTO by developed countries, which seek to reduce the policy space that developing countries may have to implement such domestic industrialization and grow their manufacturing capacity. So restriction of the application of special and differential treatment, seeking recognition for plurilaterals or joint statement initiatives, limiting the bars of the dispute settlement system, So these are ways in which the current trade regime continues to be influenced by the interests of developed countries, who are today actually embracing industrial strategy once again and are hoping to ensure their economic resilience. So there's a certain hypocrisy from that perspective. The second aspect, so this was kind of the trade rules was the first aspect that we've looked into and sought views on. The second aspect is the fact that developing countries simply cannot out-subsidy huge economies like the US or even China. To illustrate that, one example I've highlighted here are electric vehicle subsidies given out by the US under the IRA, which one estimate suggests are about $23 billion of investments. China gives something like an excess of $33 billion in a single year alone. Compared to that, this is a package of India's EV subsidies, which are being given out over a 4 to 5 year period, the sum of which amount to only about $6.5 billion. So there's a huge mismatch of scale there. Broadly speaking, from a financing perspective, particularly for green technologies, if we look at the example of renewable energy investments in terms of overall investments, developing and emerging economies, EMDEs, receive an average of only 16% of renewable energy investments. Advanced economies continue to dominate clean energy spending. So there's already a regional mismatch in allocation of funding for green technologies. Developing countries face high capital costs as a result of low credit worthiness, risk perceptions, and a number of other reasons. Even if developing countries intend to de-risk and lure in more investments through, let's say, subsidies, they cannot match the scale that advanced economies are providing. They have huge competing development imperatives, which demand that limited public budgets be allocated to a number of competing requirements, from consumer subsidies of energy or rations to, let's say, for example, India provides huge subsidies for the use of LPG gas so that people can transition from using biomass cook stoves to using gas stoves, which are slightly less polluting. So there's a number of competing developmental imperatives. Developing countries also have limited tax revenue, and many developing countries have high external debt burdens, which overall limit their fiscal space to be able to offer more subsidies or funding to private firms. So a number of considerations have come up when thinking about the way forward. These are by no means solutions or even recommendations, but just things that we're thinking through. There's definitely a need for more specific climate finance and technology transfer for green technologies from developed to developing countries to facilitate the adoption of clean technologies in our parts of the world, make them more affordable. There are models of attracting foreign FDI in domestic territories of developing countries where foreign firms can set up manufacturing in our domestic territories. So the US company First Solar has signed a $700 million deal to set up an integrated solar manufacturing plant in India this January. And there's nuance within this. There are terms and conditions that big emerging economies like India can set and dictate, but it's much more difficult, say, perhaps for LDCs and SIDS. So there are various challenges associated with this approach. What's very clear is that trade rules must not hinder sustainable development. So developing countries must be allowed to deploy industrial policy tools like subsidies and should not be prevented from using their policy space to forge their own green development growth paths. And lastly, what we're seeing is that as opposed to the WTO space, which has been hamstrung in multiple ways, one of the ways for developing countries to extract various concessions is through bilateral deals in a way that's adjacent to friendshoring, which the US and others are following. India is definitely a part of many of these conversations through bilateral deals with various countries to for green financing, climate projects. But this is not necessarily a solution or approach that one can advocate to scale up as the only way, because multilateralism definitely needs to have a future. So this is just one of the considerations that we came across. In conclusion, we've seen that there is so far limited discussion about the impact of green subsidies in advanced economies on the rest of the world, other than just the view that more investment in R&D in the US can lead to cost-reducing innovations and make the energy transition affordable for everyone. We have a number of questions remaining. So will green subsidies hurt market access for countries who are exporting to places which are giving out these huge subsidies? Do these domestic subsidies given by advanced economies hurt the self-sufficiency aspirations for countries like us? Will we see, we're already seeing a number of firms rushing to invest in the US as a result of the kind of bottomless tax credits that the IRA is offering. So does this kind of hurt FDI flows into other regions? And lastly, from a more long-term perspective, something that we've been thinking through is eventually will developing countries become buyers of green technologies produced in the global north, which will then create a new kind of dependency in an already unequal world. This is yet to be seen, but just things to think about. Yeah, and that's the end of my presentation. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. No, that was amazing. I think you laid it out so clearly.